The Grand Conclave Hall sat at the heart of Axiom Prime, a space station so large that entire cities lived inside its metal walls. And on this day, the hall was packed with representatives from over 40 spacefaring species who had come to negotiate the future of galactic territory. Captain Elias Varn walked through the massive doors with nothing but a simple dark uniform and a calm expression on his face. And he looked almost invisible compared to the alien delegations around him, who wore glowing armor and carried energy weapons on their belts and displayed every symbol of power they could manage. He was the diplomatic attaché for the Terran Coalition, the name given to humanity's united government among the stars. And humanity was still considered young out here, because they had only been traveling between worlds for about 300 years, while some of these species had been doing it for tens of thousands. The hall was shaped like a massive bowl, with rising seats on every side and a central platform where speakers would stand, and floating translation drones buzzed quietly in the air, turning every language into every other language, so that all could understand one another. Elias took his seat in the modest human section and nodded to his old friend, Ambassador Torin Gale, a Phelan diplomat whose species resembled massive bears covered in silver fur. And Torin gave him a look that carried both warmth and worry, because he knew what was coming today. The reason for this summit was simple but dangerous, and the Velhari Dominion had been pushing its borders outward into neutral space corridors that sat dangerously close to human colonies, and no one had been able to make them stop, because no one wanted to anger the most powerful military civilization in the known galaxy. Then the main doors opened again, and every voice in the hall went quiet. High Matriarch Silithara Kavas entered the hall, and the air itself seemed to change around her, and she was enormous, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with a body that was part insect and part reptile, covered in plates of bioluminescent chitin that glowed in shifting patterns of violet and gold. She walked with the slow confidence of a creature that had never once in its life been afraid of anything. And behind her came 12 elite Velhari warriors, each one carrying weapons that hummed with graviton energy, and each one trained from birth to kill without hesitation. The Velhari had dominated 3 galactic arms for over 9,000 years, and in all that time, no species had ever defeated them in open war, and Silithara was the living symbol of that legacy, because she had personally led the conquest of 11 worlds and had never known the taste of failure. She took her place at the central platform and looked around the hall the way a predator looks across an open field, and her eyes, which were large and multifaceted like a dragonfly's, swept across every delegation until they landed on the small human section. Her mandibles clicked in what the translation drones interpreted as amusement. "I see the hatchlings have sent someone," she said, and her voice carried through every speaker in the hall, and scattered laughter came from a few of the other delegations, though many stayed silent. Elias did not react, and simply folded his hands on the table in front of him, and waited. The summit moved through its opening ceremonies, and then the real discussions began, and species after species presented their territorial claims and their proposals for buffer zones and trade corridors. And when it was humanity's turn, Elias stood and walked to the central platform. He spoke clearly and without drama, and he proposed a shared access agreement for the neutral corridors, where both human and Velhari ships could travel freely under agreed-upon rules. And it was a fair proposal that asked for nothing. Unreasonable. Silithara listened with her head tilted slightly to one side. And when Elias finished, she rose from her seat, and the glow of her chitin brightened, which was a sign of strong emotion among the Velhari. "You stand before this conclave," she said, "and you ask to share space with the Velhari Dominion as though you are our equals." And she paused to let the words hang in the air before continuing. "Your species is barely out of its cradle, your fleet is small, your bodies are soft and breakable, and your weapons are primitive tubes that throw exploding metal across the void. She turned to address the full hall and spread her armored arms wide. What has humanity ever done to earn the right to stand beside civilizations that have sailed the stars since before their species learned to walk upright? She asked. And more laughter came now, because the Velhari were feared, and when the feared laugh others tend to join in. Elias stood perfectly still through all of it, and his expression did not change, even slightly. Silithara turned back to him, and her glow shifted to a deep crimson, which signaled dominance and challenge. "I invoke the Caliph," she announced, and the hall went dead silent in an instant, because everyone knew what those words meant. The Caliph was an ancient Velhari tradition, recognized under galactic law, and it was a formal challenge, where a superior power demanded that a weaker power prove its right to hold territory through a demonstration of military strength. And if the weaker power refused, it was legally accepting permanent subordination and the loss of all disputed claims. No species had ever won a Caliph against the Velhari, and most had simply surrendered rather than face the humiliation of trying. Silithara looked down at Elias with eyes that burned with absolute certainty. "Show us your strength, little human," she said, "or accept your place beneath us, where you belong." Paul was so quiet that Elias could hear the soft hum of the station's life support systems. And every eye and sensor and camera was pointed at him, waiting to see the small human crumble under the weight of the most powerful species in the galaxy. Elias took a slow breath, and then he spoke, and his voice was calm and even, and carried no anger and no fear. "The Terran coalition accepts the Caliph," he said simply. A ripple of shock passed through the hall, because no one had expected acceptance, and several delegations began whispering urgently among themselves. And Silithara's mandibles clicked rapidly in surprised amusement, because she had expected the human to fold immediately. "Bold," she said, "and foolish, but I will enjoy the display." She turned and walked back to her delegation, and her warriors fell into step behind her. And the glow of her chitin pulsed with satisfaction, because in her mind, this was already over. Elias returned to the human section and sat down quietly, and Torin leaned over to him with wide, worried eyes. "Elias," the Phelan whispered, "do you understand what you just agreed to? Because the last species that accepted a Caliph lost 40% of their territory and never recovered." Elias looked at his old friend, and for the first time something appeared in his eyes that Torin had never seen before. And it was not fear, and it was not anger, but something much deeper, and much older, and much more dangerous. "She has no idea what she's just done," Elias said quietly. Torin stared at him for a long moment, and then slowly sat back in his chair, because he had known humans for decades, and he had learned one very important lesson about them in that time. They were never more dangerous than when they were quiet. The days between the challenge and the demonstration passed slowly, and the galaxy watched with hungry eyes, because nothing excited the spacefaring races more than a Caliph. And this one promised to be especially entertaining, since everyone expected the humans to be crushed without mercy. Aboard the Velhari flagship Throne of Kale, which was a warship so massive that it blocked out the light of stars when it passed, High Matriarch Silithara Kavos stood in her war chamber, surrounded by holographic displays, and reviewed the intelligence reports on humanity for what she considered amusement rather than necessity. Her chief tactician Vareth Null stood beside her and projected data into the air between them, and the numbers told a story that made Silithara's mandibles click with contempt. "Their largest warship is 1/20th the mass of this vessel," Vareth reported, "and their primary weapons are kinetic accelerators, which are essentially metal projectiles fired at high speed, And they possess no graviton technology and no energy shielding and no planet-scale weaponry of any confirmed kind. Silithara waved one of her massive armored hands dismissively. They are children throwing rocks, she said, and I almost feel guilt for what we are about to do to their reputation. But they accepted the Caliph, and now they must face the consequences of their arrogance. She turned to face the wide viewport that showed the stars stretching endlessly in every direction, and her bioluminescent chitin glowed a deep, satisfied gold. Prepare the graviton lance for full demonstration, she ordered. I want every species in the conclave to see what real power looks like. The graviton lance was the crown jewel of Velhari military technology, and it worked by bending space-time itself to crush matter at the molecular level. And when fired at full power, it could reduce mountains to dust and crack the crust of planets. Possessed anything close to it. Silithara had already planned her demonstration down to the smallest detail, because she wanted it to be beautiful and terrifying and unforgettable. And she wanted the human captain to stand there and watch and understand exactly how small he was. Later that day, she recorded a broadcast that was sent to every delegation in the conclave, and in it she stood in full ceremonial armor, with her warriors behind her, and addressed the galaxy. In 2 days the Caliph will be fulfilled, she announced, and I invite all species to watch as the Velhari Dominion reminds the galaxy what true strength means. And then she paused, and her mandibles spread in what passed for a smile among her kind. I also wish to acknowledge the courage of the humans for accepting this challenge, because it takes a special kind of bravery for a species that still wages war with exploding metal to stand before the masters of graviton technology. Hang in the air before continuing. One must wonder how they even survived their own homeworld, she said, and the broadcast ended. Across the conclave, many species laughed at the humans and repeated Silithara's words, and made jokes about primitive weapons and fragile bodies. But a few species did not laugh at all. The felins did not laugh because they had traded with humanity for over a century, and they had visited human worlds, and they had seen things that made them uneasy in ways they could not fully explain. The Dreth did not laugh because they were an aquatic species that had once underestimated a human trade fleet during a border dispute, and the memory of what happened next still kept their admirals awake at night. The Corvani did not laugh because they were old and wise, and they had learned long ago that the most dangerous creature in any room is the one that stays quiet when everyone else is making noise. Meanwhile, aboard the human cruiser TCNS Perseverance, which sat in a quiet orbit around Axiom Prime, Captain Elias Varn sat alone in his quarters. And the room was simple and undecorated, and nothing about it suggested that the man inside was about to face the most powerful military demonstration in galactic history. He opened a secured file on his personal terminal, and the file was labeled Contingency 7, and it was marked with the highest classification the Terran Coalition possessed. And he read through it slowly and carefully, even though he had already read it dozens of times before. When he finished, he composed a single encrypted transmission and sent it to Terran High Command on Earth. And the message was short and direct, and simply requested final authorization. The reply came back within the hour, and it contained only 2 words: approved and Godspeed. Elias closed the terminal and sat in the silence for a long time, and his face showed nothing, but his hands were pressed together tightly. Anyone who knew him well would have recognized that as the only sign he ever gave that he was carrying something heavy inside. There was a knock at his door, and he opened it to find Torrance standing there with a bottle of Phelan drinking spirit, which was a thick blue liquid that could strip paint off a shuttle hull, but which humans had somehow learned to enjoy. They sat together and drank, and for a while neither of them spoke because sometimes old friends do not need words to understand each other. Finally Torrance broke the silence. "Will you tell me what you are planning?" he asked, and his deep voice was gentle with concern. Elias looked at the far wall for a moment, and then he spoke slowly and carefully. "Torin," he said, "humanity almost destroyed itself once, and we split the atom, and we built weapons that could burn our entire world to ash. And for decades, we lived with the knowledge that at any moment, everything we had ever built could be erased in." He took a sip of the blue spirit and continued. "That experience changed us," he said, "not because it made us peaceful, but because it taught us something that most species never learn. And the lesson was this: the universe does not care about pride, it does not care about tradition, and it does not care about how tall you are or how bright your armor glows. The universe only respects one thing, and that is the willingness to adapt and survive no matter the cost." Torin listened carefully, because when humans spoke about their past like this, it always meant something important was coming. "We do not have the strongest weapons in the galaxy," Elias said, "and we do not have the biggest ships or the most ancient civilization, but we have something that comes from almost killing ourselves and then choosing to keep going anyway." "And what is that?" Torin asked. Elias met his friend's eyes and said simply, "Desperation made permanent." A chill ran down his spine, despite his thick fur. After the Phelan left, Elias went to the bridge and spoke quietly with his crew, and every member of the Perseverance knew what was coming, and not one of them showed any fear. And they prepared the ship with calm, professional movements, the way humans always prepared for the most dangerous moments, with silence and steady hands. Deep in the cargo hold of the Perseverance, something sat inside a containment field, and it was a dark, featureless sphere, roughly 2 meters across, and it looked like nothing special at all. But the containment field around it was the most advanced piece of technology on the ship, and it used more power than the ship's main engines. No one on the crew spoke about the sphere, and no one looked at it longer than they needed to, and the only designation it carried was a simple code printed on the containment housing. It read, Contingency 7. Back on the throne of Kale, the night before. Demonstration. Verath Nall, the chief tactician, stood alone in the intelligence center and stared at something that bothered him, and it was a map of human colonial space, and the thing that bothered him was what was missing. Human colony worlds showed almost no orbital defense platforms, and there were no massive weapon stations, and no minefields, and no fortress networks of the kind that every other spacefaring species used to protect their territory. For any other species, this would mean they were weak and undefended, but Verath had been a tactician for over 200 years, and he had learned that when something looks wrong, it usually is wrong. He brought his concern to Silithara, who was resting in her chambers. "Matriarch," he said carefully, "the humans have almost no visible defenses around their worlds, and this troubles me, because they are not a stupid species, and they would not leave their people unprotected without reason." Eyes. "It means they are poor and weak, and cannot afford proper defenses," she said. "Stop looking for shadows where there is only empty space." Verath bowed and left, but as he walked back to his station, he could not shake the feeling that he was missing something obvious and terrible. He muttered quietly to himself so that no one else could hear. "Or perhaps they do not need orbital defenses," he said, "and if that is true, then we are all in very serious trouble." But no one was listening, and the hours continued to count down toward the demonstration that would change the galaxy forever. The proving ground was a dead moon orbiting a gas giant in the neutral corridor, and it had no atmosphere, and no life, and no value to anyone, and it existed now for only one purpose, which was to be a target for the two most different military demonstrations the galaxy had ever witnessed. Every species in the Conclave had sent observation ships and sensor arrays to watch the Calith unfold, and thousands of cameras and scanners pointed at the gray, lifeless surface of the moon, waiting for the show to begin. And across the galaxy, billions of beings watched live feeds from their homeworlds, because this was the most exciting thing to happen in decades. The Velhari flagship Throne of Kale moved into position first, because the challenger always went before the challenged, and that was the ancient rule of the Caliph. and the ship was so enormous that it cast a shadow across the entire moon as it settled into high orbit, like a metal mountain floating in the void. Matriarch Silithara Kavos stood on the command bridge of her flagship, surrounded by her officers and warriors. And her bioluminescent chitin blazed with fierce violet light, because this was her moment, and she intended to make it one that the galaxy would never forget. She opened a broadcast channel to every observation ship and every live feed. "Citizens of the Conclave," she said, and her voice was strong and proud, and filled with the absolute certainty of a leader who had never known defeat. "The Velhari Dominion will now demonstrate why we have ruled the stars for 9,000 years. Watch and remember." She turned to her weapons officer and gave a single command. "Fire the graviton lance at full power. Target the northern mountain range." The throne of Kale hummed with a sound that was felt more than heard, as its main weapon charged, and the graviton lance was the most terrifying piece of military technology in known space, because it did not burn, explode, or cut, but instead it bent the fabric of space-time itself, and used gravity as a weapon to crush anything in its path down to the molecular level. The lance fired. A beam of distorted space shot from the bow of the flagship and struck the moon's surface. And what happened next made every observer fall silent, and the entire northern mountain range, which was a chain of peaks stretching hundreds of kilometers, simply collapsed inward, as though an invisible giant had pressed its thumb down upon the world. Rock that had stood for billions of years crumbled into powder, and the powder was compressed into nothing. And in the space of 20 seconds, the mountains were gone, and in their place was a crater so deep that its bottom could not be seen by any sensor, and radiation signatures spiked across every instrument within 1,000 kilometers. The demonstration was terrifying and beautiful in the way that only truly destructive things can be beautiful. And across the air, observation fleet, and across the galaxy, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Species that had thought themselves powerful felt small, and species that had been neutral suddenly remembered why they never challenged the Velhari. And murmurs of awe and fear rippled through every channel. Silithara stood on her bridge, and her chitin glowed with triumph, and she let the moment breathe before she turned her attention to the small human cruiser that hung in orbit on the far side of the moon, looking like a toy next to her flagship. She opened a direct channel to the TCNS Perseverance. "Your turn, hatchling," she said, and her voice dripped with amusement. "Show us your exploding metal." Aboard the Perseverance, Captain Elias Varn stood on his bridge, and his crew worked around him in perfect silence, and every single one of them knew what was about to happen, and the weight of it sat on their shoulders like stone. But none of them wavered, because they were human. Humans had carried impossible weight before. "Move us into position," Elias said quietly, and the Perseverance glided forward until it was directly above the moon's equator. "Deploy Contingency 7, he ordered. The cargo bay doors opened, and a single object floated out into the void, and it was a dark, featureless sphere, roughly 2 meters in diameter, and it looked like absolutely nothing compared to the massive graviton lance that had just erased a mountain range. And as it drifted slowly toward the moon's surface, every sensor in the observation fleet focused on it with confusion. Silithara watched from her bridge, and her mandibles clicked rapidly with laughter. "That is their weapon," she said to her officers, and genuine amusement filled her voice. "A ball. They have brought a ball to answer the graviton lance." Laughter echoed across the Velhari bridge, and it spread to other ships in the fleet, as the small dark sphere continued its slow descent toward the surface of the moon. The sphere touched the surface. Nothing happened. 5 seconds passed, and then 10, and then 20, and Silithara's laughter grew louder, and she opened a broadcast channel so that the entire galaxy could hear her. "It seems the human weapon is as impressive as their civilization," she announced, small and quiet, and completely. She never finished the sentence. At exactly 30 seconds, The sphere activated, and what happened next was not an explosion, because an explosion is a simple and primitive thing, and this was something far beyond primitive. The sphere began to vibrate at a frequency that no Velhari sensor had ever recorded, and then it sank into the surface of the moon, as though the rock had turned to water beneath it. And a wave of change rippled outward from the point of contact, spreading across the moon's surface at a speed that should have been impossible. The rock was not being destroyed, burned, or crushed, or vaporized, and instead it was being taken apart at the molecular level, piece by piece, atom by atom, and every atom that was taken apart was being rebuilt into something new. The Velhari chief tactician, Vareth Nal, was the first to understand what he was seeing, and the color drained from his chitin so completely that he looked like a ghost. "It is a von Neumann device," he whispered, and his voice cracked with something that the Velhari had not felt in 9,000 years, which was pure undiluted terror. The moon was being consumed. From every observation ship, the same impossible sight filled every screen, and the gray dead surface of the moon was dissolving like sugar in water, and in its place a shimmering cloud of particles was forming and growing and expanding with every passing second. And the cloud was not random, but structured and organized and alive with purpose. Each particle in the cloud was a nanoscale weapons platform built from the converted matter of the moon itself, and each one carried a microscopic antimatter charge, and they were self-replicating, which meant that every new particle built more particles from the matter around it, and the process accelerated exponentially. 40 seconds after activation, half the moon was gone. 50 seconds after activation, only a quarter remained. At 60 seconds, the moon ceased to exist. Where a celestial body had orbited for 4 billion years, there now hung a vast shimmering cloud that stretched thousands of kilometers in every direction. And the cloud contained trillions upon trillions of weaponized nanomachines, each one a tiny engine of destruction, each one linked to every other in a network of perfect coordination. Every sensor in the Conclave fleet screamed warnings because the energy readings coming from the cloud were beyond anything their instruments were designed to measure, and the collective destructive power contained in that shimmering mass was enough to consume a fleet or crack a planet, or if left unchecked, devour an entire star system. And then, as every being in the galaxy watched in stunned silence, the cloud moved. It shifted and flowed and organized itself into a shape, and the shape was a geometric pattern that every human recognized instantly, because it was the emblem of the Terran Coalition, and it hung in space where the moon had been, burning with cold light, like a signature written across the void. The message was clear, and it needed no translation. We did not destroy a mountain. We ate your moon and turned it into a weapon, and we did it in 1 minute. The emblem held for 5 seconds, and then the cloud went dark as every nanomachine simultaneously deactivated, and the trillions of particles broke apart into harmless dust that scattered into the void, leaving nothing behind but empty space and silence. Aboard the Perseverance, Elias let out a long, slow breath, and his hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Contingency 7 demonstration complete," he said. "Signal the Conclave that the Terran Coalition has fulfilled its Calith obligation." Across the observation fleet, there was no sound, because there were no words in any language that could respond to what had just happened. On the bridge of the throne of Kale, Silithara stood frozen in place, and her chitin, which had blazed with triumphant violet light for the entire demonstration, had gone completely dark for the first time in her life, and the absence of light on a Velhari was the most profound expression of shock their biology could produce. Therath stood beside her, and he too was dark and silent, and after a very long time he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "They were never undefended," he said. "Every rock, and every moon, and every asteroid in their territory was a weapon they had not yet activated. Silithara said nothing because for the first time in her centuries-long existence, she had nothing to say. The galaxy had just changed, and everyone knew it, and the silence that filled the void where the moon had been was the loudest sound any of them had ever heard. The hours after the demonstration were chaos wrapped in silence, because every delegation in the conclave was screaming on private channels, while the public channels remained almost completely dead, as though the galaxy itself was holding its breath, trying to understand what it had just witnessed. The Grand Conclave Hall on Axiom Prime filled faster than it had ever filled before, as ambassadors and military officials and intelligence officers rushed to their seats, demanding answers and demanding explanations, and demanding to know how long humanity had been hiding a weapon that could eat moons. Captain Elias Varn walked into the hall with the same calm, unhurried steps he always used. He took his place at the central platform and waited for the noise to die down, and when it finally did, he looked out at the assembled representatives of 40 species, and he spoke. "I understand that you have questions," he said, "and I will answer what I can." Came from the Rithian delegate, whose species was known for their blunt directness. "How long have humans possessed this technology?" the Rithian demanded. "The theoretical framework was developed approximately 180 years ago," Elias answered. "The first functional prototype was completed 90 years ago." The hall erupted because 90 years meant that humanity had been sitting on the most powerful weapon in galactic history for nearly a century, while every other species had treated them as primitives with metal slugs and tin ships. "Why was it hidden?" shouted the delegate from the Moravi Collective. Elias paused and chose his next words with great care. "Because we built it out of fear," he said, "and not fear of you, but fear of ourselves." The hall went quiet again, because that was not the answer anyone had expected. "Humanity almost destroyed itself once," Elias continued, and his voice was steady and honest, and carried no pride. "We discovered how to split atoms, and the first thing we did with that knowledge was build weapons that could burn our entire world. And for generations we lived under the shadow of our own extinction, not because of any alien threat, but because we could not stop pointing our own guns at our own heads." He let that sink in before continuing. "When we finally came to the stars, we carried that memory with us, like a scar that never fully healed. And we swore that we would never again be helpless, but we also swore that we would never use our most terrible creations, unless we had no other choice." He looked directly at the Velhari delegation, where Silithara sat in darkness, her chitin still completely without light. The von Neumann collapse device was built as a deterrent of absolute last resort, he said. It was never meant to be revealed, and it was never meant to be used, and we hoped with everything we had that we would never need to show the galaxy what we did. "We're capable of." He paused, and then said something that made the entire hall go still. "We showed you a campfire," he said, "because we did not want you to see the sun." No one spoke for a very long time after that. Aboard the throne of Kale, which still hung in orbit around the gas giant Silithara, sat alone in her private chambers. The room was dark because she had ordered all lights extinguished, since the glow of her own chitin had always been enough to illuminate any space she occupied. But now her chitin produced no light at all. She was not just defeated, and she knew this with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade, because defeat was something she could have understood and recovered from, since the Velhari were warriors, and warriors sometimes lost. But this was something else entirely. This was the realization that everything she had believed about the galaxy was wrong. She had stood before the conclave and mocked a species that could have destroyed the Velhari dominion at any point in the last 90 years. And they had not done so, and they had not done so not because they were weak or afraid. but because they had chosen not to. And that choice was more terrifying to her than any weapon. A Velhari could understand an enemy that attacked with everything it had, because that was honest and that was war. But a species that held the power to devour worlds and simply kept it locked away, and smiled and pretended to be harmless, while everyone around them laughed and pointed and called them primitives. That was something Silithara could not comprehend, and it shook the very foundation of who she was. Her chief tactician Verath entered the chambers quietly, and stood in the darkness, and waited for permission to speak. And when Silithara gave a slight nod, he said what he had been thinking since the moon disappeared. "Matriarch," he said carefully, "I have completed my analysis, and I now understand why. Colony worlds had no orbital defenses." Silithara did not respond, but he continued anyway. "They did not need them," he said, "because every asteroid and every moon and every piece of rock in their territory was not just rock. It was raw material waiting to be converted. Their entire territory was a loaded weapon, pointed in every direction at once, and we never saw it, because we were looking for gun platforms and energy shields, and we did not think to look at the rocks themselves." He paused, and then added quietly, "We were surrounded by their weapons our entire lives, and we called them pebbles." Silithara closed her multifaceted eyes, and for the first time in her centuries of life, she felt something she had never felt before, which was the cold, hollow weight of being fundamentally wrong about something she had been certain of. The political consequences hit almost immediately, and within the Velhari Dominion, word spread fast, because the military networks carried the footage of the demonstration to every Velhari world, and the reaction was seismic. And Silithara's rivals, who had waited for decades for a sign of weakness, now saw their opportunity. She was the one who had issued the Caliph, and she was the one who had publicly mocked the species that had just demonstrated the most devastating weapon in galactic history. And she was the one whose pride had led the entire Dominion to this moment of humiliation. Messages began arriving from the other matriarchs of the ruling council, demanding explanations, and demanding her resignation, and demanding to know how the supreme commander of the most powerful military in the galaxy had failed so completely to understand the enemy she had chosen to challenge. Silithara read each message and felt her authority cracking like ice under pressure. Then something unexpected happened. There was a request for a private meeting, and it came not from any Velhari, but from Captain Elias. Varn. Silithara almost refused, because the thought of facing the human who had just unmade her world was almost too much to bear. But something stopped her, and she realized it was curiosity, because despite everything, she wanted to understand this species that made no sense to her. They met in a small neutral room on Axiom Prime, with no guards, and no cameras, and no witnesses. And Elias walked in and sat down across from the most powerful military leader in the galaxy. And he did not gloat, and he did not smirk, and he did not carry himself with the arrogance of a victor. Instead, he looked at her with something in his eyes that she could not identify at first, but slowly recognized as respect. "I did not come here to humiliate you," he said, "and I want you to know that what happened today was not what we wanted." Silithara stared at him, and her voice was rough when she spoke. "Then why did you do it?" she asked. "Because you gave us no choice. Simply. The Caliph is binding under galactic law, and if we had refused, we would have lost our territory, and our people would have been at risk. And we will do anything to protect our people. Anything at all, but we take no joy in it." He leaned forward slightly. "Matriarch," he said, "humanity has studied the Velhari for a long time, and we do not see an enemy when we look at your people. We see a civilization that survived a death world and built an empire through sheer determination and unity. And those are qualities we respect deeply, because they are the same qualities that kept us alive when we almost burned our own planet to nothing." Silithara listened, and she could find no deception in his words, and no mockery, and no hidden blade. "The Terran coalition does not want the Dominion's territory," Elias continued, "and we do not want your submission. What we want is something much simpler. We want a neighbor, not a subject. We want an ally, not a... He reached into his uniform and placed a data chip on the table between them. This is a proposal for a mutual defense and scientific exchange treaty, he said. Equal terms, equal respect, no subordination on either side. Silithara looked at the chip, and then looked at the human, and she understood at last what made this species so terrifying. Because they had just proven they could destroy her entire civilization. And their very next action was to offer friendship. And that combination of absolute power and genuine mercy was something the galaxy had never seen before. She reached out and took the chip, and her chitin flickered with the faintest hint of light for the first time since the moon had died. There is a saying among my people, she said slowly, that the strongest warrior is the one who chooses when to fight. But I think your people have a better understanding. The strongest warrior is the one who chooses when not to fight. And looked down at Elias. And then she did something that no Velhari Supreme Commander had done in 9,000 years of recorded history. She bowed her head to another species, not in submission and not in defeat, but in recognition of something greater than military power, which was the wisdom to hold destruction in your hands and choose to offer peace instead. We mocked the fire, she said in broken Terran standard that she had clearly been practicing, and did not see the forge behind it. Elias stood and bowed his head in return, and in that small room, with no witnesses, two civilizations took the first step towards something that neither had expected when this day began. And somewhere, watching from a distance, Ambassador Torin Gale smiled to himself, because he had always known that humans were at their most dangerous when they were quiet. But he was only now learning that they were at their most remarkable when they were kind. 6 months had passed since the day the moon disappeared, and the galaxy was still adjusting to a reality that none of them had imagined possible. Because in the space of 1 minute, everything that every species thought they knew about power and strength and hierarchy among the stars had been turned completely upside down. The footage of the Caliph demonstration had spread to every corner of known space and had been watched billions of times and studied by every military and scientific institution in existence. And no matter how many times the analysts reviewed it, the conclusion was always the same, which was that humanity had been the most dangerous species in the galaxy for nearly a century, and no one had known. No species threatened human territory anymore, and not because of any official agreement or treaty, but because every admiral and general and warlord in the galaxy now looked at the asteroids and moons in human space and saw not rocks, but sleeping weapons that could wake up and devour everything around them at a moment's notice. But something else had happened that no one had predicted, and it was perhaps more significant than the demonstration itself. The Terran-Velhari Compact had been signed. It was a mutual defense and scientific exchange treaty negotiated in the weeks following the Caliph, and it bound the two most powerful civilizations in the galaxy together as equals. And the day it was announced, the political landscape of the conclave shifted so dramatically that several long-standing alliances collapsed overnight, and new ones formed in their place. No one dared challenge either species alone, and challenging both together was unthinkable. And so, a strange and unexpected peace settled over the galaxy like a blanket thrown over a fire. On the Velhari homeworld of Kale Prime, a planet of towering spires and bioluminescent forests, where the air itself seemed to glow, High Matriarch Silithara Kavas stood before her people for the first time since the demonstration, and she was changed in ways that went far deeper than politics. Her chitin glowed again, but the color was different now, and where once it had burned with fierce violet and gold, signaling dominance and conquest, it now shifted in softer patterns of blue and silver, which among the Velhari signaled contemplation and wisdom and the willingness to learn. She addressed the entire Dominion through a broadcast that reached every Velhari world and every ship and every outpost in their vast territory. And her voice carried a weight that was new, because it was the weight of humility, which is far heavier than pride. For 9,000 years, she began, we have believed that strength is the only measure of worth in this galaxy. And for 9,000 years, we have been partly right, because strength does matter, and it always will. But I stand before you today to tell you that we were also partly wrong. Billions watching held their breath. I challenged a species that I believed was beneath us, she continued. I looked upon small, soft creatures who traveled in small ships and carried primitive weapons, and I saw prey, and I mocked them before the entire galaxy, because I was certain that they had nothing that could stand against the power of the Velhari Dominion. Her chitin flickered with a pulse of deep crimson, which was the Velhari expression of honest shame. I was wrong, she said, not because they proved to be stronger than us in the way I understood strength, but because they showed me a kind of strength I had never even considered. They held the power to destroy us completely, and they chose not to, not because they were weak, but because they were wise, and that wisdom came from a place of suffering that we have never known. She straightened to her full height, and her glow steadied into calm silver. They nearly destroyed themselves once, she said. They built weapons that could have ended their own civilization, and they came so close to using them that the scars of that time are still written into everything they do. And from that near death, they learned something that 9,000 years of conquest never taught us, which is that the greatest strength is not the ability to destroy, but the choice to build instead. She looked directly into the broadcast sensor, and her multifaceted eyes caught the light and reflected it back like stars. We did not lose the Caliph, she declared. We were given a lesson, and I intend to learn from it. From this day forward, the Velhari Dominion will open its borders to trade and cultural exchange for the first time in our history, because isolation made us proud, and pride made us blind. And I will not lead a blind people. The reaction across the Dominion was divided, as some Velhari embraced the change and others resisted it fiercely, because 9,000 years of tradition does not bend easily. But Silithara held firm, and her authority, which had nearly shattered in the days after the Caliph, was now rebuilt on a stronger foundation, because leaders who can admit they were wrong are far more trustworthy than leaders who pretend they never are. On Earth, Captain Elias Varn returned home not to celebrations or parades, but to a quiet debriefing room deep inside Terran High Command headquarters, which was buried beneath a mountain range on the continent that humans called North America. He sat across from a panel of admirals and civilian officials, and he gave his report in the same calm, measured voice he always used. And when he was finished, the room was silent for a long time. The von Neumann device performed exactly as designed, said Admiral Chen, who was the oldest member of the panel. And the Velhari response was within projected parameters. You did well, Elias. Permission to speak freely? Elias said. Granted. Recommend that Contingency 7 be resealed and returned to maximum classification, he said. The galaxy now knows it exists, and that is enough. They do not need to see it again, and we should pray that they never do. The panel agreed unanimously, and the von Neumann collapse device was locked away once more, in a facility whose location was known to fewer than 20 people in all of human civilization. And the weight of it settled back into the quiet darkness where humanity kept its most terrible creations. Elias left the mountain and drove to a small house near the coast, where the ocean met a rocky shore, and he sat on the porch and watched the waves and breathed salt air, and let himself feel the exhaustion he had been carrying for months. He thought about the moon that no longer existed, and about the trillions of nanomachines that had briefly filled the void where it had been, and he thought about Silithara, and the way her light had gone dark, and then slowly returned. And he thought about the strange and heavy responsibility of being part of a species that had built God-killing weapons, and then had to live with the knowledge of what they could do. He did not feel like a hero, and he did not feel like a conqueror. He felt like a man who had shown the world a loaded gun, and then put it back in the safe. And he hoped, with every fiber of his being, that no one would ever need to open that safe again. 3 months later, a new ship launched from a joint construction facility that had been built in the neutral corridor, and the ship was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, because it was crewed by both humans and Velhari working side by side, and it was not a warship, but an exploration vessel designed to travel beyond the galactic rim into the unknown spaces that no species had ever charted. They named it the Humble Fire. The human crew members and the Velhari crew members had spent weeks learning each other's languages, customs, and ways of thinking, and it was not easy because the two species were so different in almost every way. But they found common ground in the most unexpected places, because both species came from dangerous worlds, and both species had survival written into their bones, and both species understood what it meant to fight for the right to exist. On the bridge of the Humble Fire, a human engineer named Mara sat next to a Velhari navigator named Kelthos, and they worked together to plot a course into the deep black, and Kelthos turned to Mara and asked a question that had been bothering him. "Your species had the power to rule the galaxy," he said. "Why did you not use it?" Mara thought about it for a moment, and then smiled. "Because we tried ruling ourselves once," she said, "and we were terrible at it. So we figured we should probably get that right before we started telling anyone else what to do." Kelthos considered this, and then made a sound that Mara had learned was the Velhari equivalent of laughter, and the ship jumped to faster-than-light speed and vanished into the unknown, carrying the first joint crew of two species who had been enemies a year ago, and were now something that neither of them had a word for yet, but that both of them hoped might become friendship. Far away on Axiom Prime, in a quiet room that overlooked the stars, Ambassador Torrin Gale sat at his desk and recorded a private journal entry, and his deep voice was thoughtful and slow as he spoke into the recorder. "I have spent my career among the species of this galaxy," he said, "and I have seen empires rise and fall, and I have watched civilizations destroy each other over territory and pride and fear. And in all that time I have asked myself one question over and over again, which is this: what would a species do if it held ultimate power?" He paused and looked out at the stars. "Every species answers that question differently," he continued. "Velhari used their power to conquer. The Moravi used theirs to isolate. The Rithians used theirs to trade. But the humans gave an answer that none of us expected." He leaned back in his chair and folded his massive furred hands together. "They built a weapon that could unmake worlds," he said, "and they locked it away in the dark. And when they were forced to reveal it, they did so with steady hands and heavy hearts. And then their very next act was to offer peace to the very species that had humiliated them before the entire galaxy." He shook his head slowly in wonder. "Every species in the galaxy has asked what they would do with ultimate power," he said, "and the humans answered. They kept it holstered, and they smiled, and they asked if we would like to be friends." He paused one final time, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "And that, I think, is the most frightening answer of all, because it means they are not just powerful and they are not just clever. They are something far more rare and far more dangerous than either of those things." He reached forward and stopped the recorder, and sat in the quiet dark, and thought about the species that had almost burned itself to nothing, and then risen from the ashes, carrying fire in one hand and an open palm in the other. And outside the window, the stars burned on as they always had. But the galaxy that moved between them was different now, because somewhere out in the black, a ship called the Humble Fire carried humans and Velhari together into the unknown. And the name of that ship said everything that needed to be said about the species that had chosen it. Because in the end, the matriarch did not fall to a weapon. She fell to something far older and far more human, which was the quiet, terrifying grace of power that chooses not to strike.